Hey everybody, Steam had a free weekend of Company of Heroes 3, so I decided to go ahead and give it a try. Now, before you bring up Company Heroes 1 and 2, I want to mention that I am eventually going to be doing a redux of Company Heroes 1, and I will eventually be doing a full review of Company Heroes 2. I just haven't gotten around to those yet. But suffice to say, I have of course played the original game and Company Heroes 2. Now, I had a lot of technical problems with Company Heroes 2, and early on I had a lot of issues with the way they monetized the game as well. They've since sorted out a lot of those issues, so I will of course be taking another look at it eventually and trying to do a full review of it. And of course I will also be doing a redux of the original Company Heroes eventually, I just don't know when that's going to be. But anyway, I couldn't pass up at least taking a look at Company Heroes 3 considering it was on free weekend, because obviously, I really wasn't optimistic about spending, especially full price, on a modern Relic Entertainment release, but I don't really have to worry about that with the free weekend. So I did get a chance to mess around with a couple of hours of campaign, as well as a couple of hours of skirmish. And I'm just kind of bewildered by the whole thing. Because you have to remember that Company of Heroes 2 released back in 2013, so it's been quite a while since we got a Company of Heroes game. In fact, it's been about a decade. And there definitely hasn't been a decade's worth of development and improvements between Company of Heroes 2 and 3. Visually, Company of Heroes 3 is really unimpressive, and at times actually looks worse than Company of Heroes 2 did in terms of visual fidelity, which makes absolutely no sense. But even aside from visual fidelity, Company Heroes 3 just lacks a lot of the smaller touches that really made the visuals in 1 and 2 pop. Things like the way they use particle and smoke effects to make explosions seem really powerful and concussive, or how the infantry would be shredded by sufficiently powerful weaponry and blown apart, limbs flying all over the place, which made the combat so much more visceral and intense. And then you get into Company Heroes 3 and most of the time the infantry just falls over, or they might flop over like a rag doll if they get hit with an explosion, but the bodies are completely intact, and if there is any actual gore in it, then it just consists of a puff of blood and then the unit's just not really there anymore. It looks awful. And while the environmental destruction is still definitely there, it's noticeably toned down compared to both Company Heroes 2 and even 1, which again makes no sense considering that we expect that kind of technology to improve over time with more powerful hardware and better programming routines, instead of either stagnating or getting worse like it does in Company Heroes 3. Sure, it's not a massive downgrade compared to the previous two games, but it is still noticeably weaker destruction, which contributes to the entire combat feel being considerably less visceral and satisfying. But really a lot of that loss of that visceral, satisfying combat feel we had in Company Heroes 1 and 2 was lost due to the considerably weaker audio in Company Heroes 3. I don't know whose idea it was to mix the audio the way they did in Company Heroes 3, but the end result is that everything sounds horribly off-kilter. Sometimes gun and explosion sounds are nice and punchy and in your face, other times they're way too quiet. Sometimes the voices are way too loud, other times they're way too quiet, and background sound effects will actually overpower them so you can't hear what someone's saying. It is so all over the place and so wildly inconsistent that you can't help but wonder if the audio designers even have any idea what they're doing. It's the same kind of problem I see with a lot of modern films, where the audio mixing is just so horribly all over the place that sometimes you won't be able to hear what someone is saying, so you turn up the audio, and then in the next scene they just start blasting you with the music and it's so loud you have to turn the audio back down again. It's the same exact kind of effect in Company Heroes 3, and it's just about as annoying as when it happens in the movies too. So they slightly messed up the visuals, nothing catastrophic, but definitely a letdown compared to the previous two games, and they really messed up the audio, so that means that the presentation is just kind of a mess in general. But what about the game itself? Well, there are a few things I need to mention here. The first is that a lot of people have been reporting a lot of technical problems. Tons of glitches, soft locks, crashes, that sort of thing. I cannot personally confirm or deny any of those technical problems other than a few mild glitches here and there that I ran into that were mostly just some visual glitches that don't really matter. I never had the game crash on me. It ran perfectly fine the entire time I was playing, with all the visuals maxed out to the best I could, even though it wouldn't let me completely max them out because I don't apparently have enough VRAM on my 3080 12GB model. Because clearly this game actually needs 16GB of VRAM to look like it does. But anyway, point is that for the very limited amount of time I put into the game, which was about 5 or so hours, I personally didn't run into any major technical problems, but I don't really think that's enough time with the game to really make a determination on whether or not those problems are still present. It's likely an entirely your mileage may vary situation, where depending on your individual hardware configuration, you might run into a lot of issues, whereas other people like myself may not really run into all that many technical problems, if we even run into them at all. So while I'd like to give you a more definitive statement on the current technical state of the game, I really can't, just because I didn't really run into any major technical problems, and for me it generally ran fine. But what about the gameplay and the amount of content on offer here? Well, that's where things get really messy. Because the big new feature in Company of Heroes 3 is the significant overhaul they made to the campaign. In Company Heroes 1 and 2, you had a much more traditional real-time strategy campaign style, where you would go from mission to mission, each one would have its own specific objectives, it was relatively scripted, and it all generally worked quite well. The campaign in Company Heroes 3, on the other hand, is more reminiscent of the kinds of campaigns you see in the likes of Warhammer 40,000, Dawn of War, Dark Crusade, and Soulstorm, where you start at one particular section of the overall campaign map, and then from there you need to send units out to capture territories and fight battles with the enemy, and so on and so forth. And the way they've set this up in Company Heroes 3 is that you will be controlling the Allied forces as they fight their way through Italy, and along the way you have two generals that will be advising you throughout. You have an American general and a British general, and they have two very different ideas on how the war should be fought. The American is, of course, extremely aggressive and wants to just constantly hound the Germans, whereas the British general's approach is much more slow-paced and really focused on getting logistics set up before going on any kinds of offensives. And the idea that Relic had with this is that by taking the advice of the two generals one way or the other, you will gradually earn relation points with them, and that will unlock additional abilities as you continue throughout the campaign. The thing is, for this idea to really work the way Relic intended it to work, you would have needed to set up the campaign in such a way to where it was a tight balancing act, where you might be able to maintain relationship with both generals simultaneously, but the margin for error would be really narrow, so if you wanted to maintain all of those relationships simultaneously, you would need to have a very strong strategic acumen. And while admittedly I haven't played the campaign to completion, it doesn't really seem like that's the way they've set up the campaign in Company Heroes 3. Instead, from what I was able to play, it seems like they give you plenty of time and units to complete all of the objectives that the generals posit for you in very short order, and you never really need to worry about it. Obviously, there's a chance that might change later on in the campaign, and I just hadn't gotten that far yet, because again, it's a free weekend that I was messing around with here. I didn't have the time to go through the whole campaign. But I really couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to change later on in the campaign, and honestly, I didn't even really care all that much anyway, because the campaign itself was incredibly boring. When you're sending out units on the strategic map, most of the engagements you're going to be fighting are actually just auto-calc battles that you have no say over beyond just sending your unit to fight whatever it is. Whether it be a settlement that you're trying to capture for the territory, or just running into an enemy unit somewhere on the map, it'll just automatically calculate the results of the battle. It might eliminate one of the units if they lose enough health in the results, and then you just continue on to the next objective. The only times you have to actually fight proper battles during the campaign are when you go up to certain settlements that you need to capture for the territory, and it will either give you a mission, or it will give you a skirmish. If it's a skirmish, then it just plays out exactly like a 1v1 skirmish would if you were playing against AI or online. Capture the various sectors on the map in order to gain resource rate trickle, and in the case of victory points, gradually reduce the enemy's score until eventually they hit 0, or just capture the territories and build up your base back at headquarters in order to eventually churn out enough units to overrun the enemy's base and defeat them once and for all. And much like in every other real-time strategy game where the campaign consists of a strategy map that's turn-based, followed by skirmish battles, the skirmish battles in the campaign of Company Heroes 3 are just really dull. If I wanted to play skirmish, I would just play skirmish. I play campaigns so I can get a campaign experience, and that is exactly what the missions are actually supposed to be. They are structured campaign missions like you would get in Company Heroes 1 and 2, and they are far and away the best parts of the campaign. Unfortunately, since those are centered around major actions of the Italian campaign during World War II, they're pretty few and far between, and so most of the campaign is just auto-calc battles and skirmish. The only thing that really differentiates the skirmish in campaign versus the regular skirmish mode is that over the course of the campaign, your units will gradually earn skill points that you can then put into giving them various passive bonuses as well as active abilities that you can call upon during the battles themselves. And to put it simply, that's just not enough to make them interesting. Because the simple fact of the matter is that the skirmish battles during the campaign are all 1v1, which is not only the worst way of playing Company of Heroes 3, but it was also the worst way to play Company of Heroes 1 and 2. Really, the series is at its best when you're doing either 3v3 or 4v4. Even 2v2 is significantly better than 1v1. Which of course makes the campaign's insistence upon 1v1 so much more frustrating, because for a new player, generally they're probably going to want to play the campaign first, and if they play the campaign of Company Heroes 3 first, that gives the impression that it's all meant to be 1v1. Company Heroes 1 and 2 didn't have that problem because while the campaign missions were certainly 1v1 technically, they were actually structured campaign missions that you could see as separate from the skirmish mode, and so it never really became a problem. Meanwhile, in Company Heroes 3, they just throw a bunch of skirmish matches into the campaign and it's all 1v1, which is the worst way of playing the game, so a new player is going to play those, think that 1v1 is the main mode for the game when it's really not, and it's going to be a hell of a wake-up call for them. So the campaign just doesn't really work for Company Heroes 3. It would have been much better off if they had had the same style that they did with Company Heroes 1 and 2, a more structured story kind of campaign where you go from mission to mission and every single mission is individually crafted. But of course that is no longer in vogue. That's too old-fashioned. We need to have these more grand strategy light campaigns that kick any kind of storytelling or mission structures to the curb in favor of just basically being a glorified tutorial for the multiplayer with a bunch of extra crap bolted onto it. And if the end result of that is that the campaign battles are basically just worse skirmish battles, then why would you play the campaign when you can just hop into skirmish, set everything the way you want it to, and have a much better time? But anyway, I've rambled enough about the campaign. Point is that while the campaign is normally one of the stronger suits of the franchise, at least with Company Heroes 1 and 2, in Company Heroes 3, the campaign's just not good. Or at least I should say that the Italian campaign, which is the main campaign of the game, is not good. I did not, however, get a chance to play the North African campaign during my time with the free weekend, and that does seem like it's more in line with what we would normally see with the Company Heroes franchise, a more story-driven campaign from mission to mission, with each mission actually being a crafted mission instead of just a skirmish. So who knows, maybe that campaign is better, but I'm not necessarily going to hold my breath about that, let's put it that way. So that gets the campaign stuff out of the way, but what about the general gameplay experience? Basically skirmish mode and the kind of customization options and things like that. Well, currently in the game there is the Wehrmacht, the Afrika Korps, the British forces, and the American forces. And you can customize each faction's loadout, so to speak, to have up to 3 of the 4 available battle groups for that particular faction available for you to select in-game. Battle groups, of course, replacing doctrines from previous Company Heroes games. basically a selection of both passive and active abilities that you can call on during the battle, as well as unique units for those specific factions and doctrines that you can either call in or can then produce during the battle. And 3 of those battle groups are blocked behind a paywall. There's one that is campaign exclusive, so you can only pick the British Air and Sea Company for the Italian campaign. So they limit your options even in the main campaign behind a paywall, because of course they do. And then for the skirmish and online, there is the U.S. Forces Advanced Infantry Battle Group and the Wehrmacht's Italian Coastal Defense Battle Group that are blocked behind the paywall. And that paywall is the Hammer and Shield expansion pack, which is an extra $17 US on top of the $60 US that they want for the base game. And it contains those 3 battle groups, and a grand total of 10 new premium cosmetics split across 4 cosmetic packs. So the US forces get the boardroom skin for half-tracks and Hellcats, so specifically skins for 2 of the vehicles in their repertoire. The British get the Nature's Vanguard skin for CWTs and Dingoes, again, 2 individual vehicles among their entire arsenals. The Afrika Corps get the Blocking Force Infantry pack, which is a set of skins for 4 of the infantry units available to the Afrika Corps. And then the Wehrmacht get the Fallen Leaf skin for Panzer IVs and Stug 3s. And that's it. 3 battle groups, one of which is campaign exclusive, and a few cosmetic items that will undoubtedly clash with the rest of your army because they're going to stand out compared to them. Thus, of course, pushing you into the cosmetic shop, because, of course, the game had a cosmetic shop introduced in the first major patch that also introduced war bonds as a premium currency, because, of course, they have to have a premium currency to obfuscate the amount of money you're actually spending, and, of course, you can't just buy the exact amount of war bonds that you want to spend on whatever cosmetic item that you're looking to get. You have to buy them in packs, and the packs are always in specific set amounts, and the prices in the shop do not correspond with the prices of the packs. So you're always going to have to either buy multiple packs to get to the amount that you want to spend, or you'll have to buy the next step up of packs that leaves you with currency left over, and then you're going to want to get rid of that because it's just sitting in your account and it ends up being a waste otherwise. So you either spend it on inconsequential things, or you have to spend even more money in order to actually afford other things. It's incredibly manipulative. It's rampant across the entire industry at this point, and I am so very tired of it. And the especially frustrating part is it's not even like this is anything all that new for Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes 2 was absolutely plagued with microtransactions, and while eventually they sorted that out to some degree, but even to this day, if you look at the various prices of the DLCs available for Company of Heroes 2, and just the way that they're even trying to sell that game and its DLCs to you, it becomes really confusing trying to figure out exactly how to get all of the content in the game. So, if nothing else, at least Company of Heroes 3 is very straightforward in how they're nickel and diming you for every conceivable thing, but they're still nickel and diming you for every conceivable thing. Because of course they are, that's modern gaming in a nutshell. But anyway, point about the game trying to push you into buying even more stuff for it aside, you select your 3 doctrines or battle groups for your faction, you hop into the match, and then once you're in the match, you select whichever battle group you want to go with, and as you continue to play, you'll gain experience points, and those will go into giving you command points. Those command points can then be used to unlock various features of your battle group. And of course, the actual gameplay moment to moment is much like it was in Company of Heroes 2 and Company of Heroes 1, where you have some light base building elements where you need to build specific structures within your base in order to be able to train different types of units. as well as get various upgrades for your units. But the real meat of the gameplay is in more of the tactical combat, where you're having to position units in cover and establish firing angles for things like machine guns or, of course, bunkers and things like that. You need to worry about the facing of your vehicles, because the front armor is always going to be the strongest, and then the side armor is weaker than that, and then the rear armor is even weaker than that. So your vehicles will take considerably more damage if their rear or side is facing the enemy than if their front is, and sometimes shots will even just bounce off of the armor entirely if they're getting shot from the front. So vehicle facing is definitely still important, and when vehicles take particularly powerful hits, they can still suffer critical damage that will do things like mess with the engine and so on. And you'll ultimately need to use a combination of infantry and vehicles in order to succeed, because you'll need both anti-infantry and anti-vehicle units, and that's going to be spread out across a variety of units across all the factions. And while obviously the playtime I had wasn't really enough to truly determine what kind of balancing the game has, I can say that even with my limited amount of playtime, the balancing still felt kind of off, and I think a lot of that is due to the way they've set up a lot of the units. You see, in previous Company Heroes games, when you, say, spawned an infantry unit, then they would have their default loadout, and then you might be able to customize them a bit by giving them a few extra weapons. You might be able to customize them into having more close-range capability by giving them some submachine guns, or give them a light machine gun so that they can lay down some more suppressing fire and be more effective against infantry. Or you might be able to give them anti-tank weapons so that they can be fairly effective against vehicles, particularly if they're attacking them from the sides or rear. And that is something that carries forward somewhat in Company of Heroes 3, but the big difference is that there is far less of a trade-off for the units in Company Heroes 3 versus the previous games. In the previous games, if you specialized a unit with those additional weapons, then they would come with hefty downsides. For example, if you gave them anti-tank capabilities, they were far less effective against infantry than if you hadn't given them anything at all. And so you had to be careful with how you deployed those units so they wouldn't get just completely shredded by infantry. You had to give them some kind of support. Meanwhile, in Company of Heroes 3, there's not really much of a downside for equipping your various units with additional weaponry. Take, for example, a unit of Jaeger. They are powerful anti-infantry infantry. They have powerful rifles that are capable of just shredding through infantry. But you can also equip one of the squad members with the Panzerschreck. This gives them a very powerful anti-vehicle and anti-tank weapon. Now, of course, if you were playing Company of Heroes 2 or 1, equipping the Panzerschreck to that unit would reduce their anti-infantry capabilities significantly. But that's not what happens in Company Heroes 3. Instead, they still have 4 squad members who have those powerful anti-infantry rifles, and they're really just as effective without that one additional rifle. And now they also have a very powerful anti-tank weapon that can just absolutely shred enemy vehicles. So now this unit has basically no downsides. Now keep in mind that while this is the first unit that pops into my head as an example of this phenomenon, it's a phenomenon that occurs across a variety of units throughout the game across really all of the factions, and it makes army composition less important in Company Heroes 3 than it was in the previous games, which in turn reduces its strategic depth. It's certainly not enough to completely destroy the game's balancing or anything, but it does noticeably affect it, and it ultimately makes the entire experience feel noticeably weaker than both of the previous Company of Heroes games, which, again, doesn't really make sense considering this came out a decade after Company of Heroes 2. They should have learned from the mistakes of Company of Heroes 2, and yet it's abundantly clear they did not. Thus, while all of these fundamentals I mentioned, like units in cover, vehicle facing, capturing resource points, and having that trickle rate of 3 resources, which are manpower, munitions, and fuel, and utilizing those to produce the various units and vehicles and weapon upgrades and things like that you'll be using throughout the match, as well as the battle group system, which again replaces the doctrine system, and all of its effects are all still present and accounted for. They're noticeably weaker than previous games in the series, rather than stronger like they should be. The end result of all of this is that the more you look at Company Heroes 3, the worse of a value proposition it is. In addition to the obnoxiousness factor of the microtransactions, you have a main campaign, the Italian campaign, which is just incredibly weak. And even though the core gameplay of Company of Heroes is still present, accounted for, and has its moments, it's all severely lacking in the amount of content and is, weirdly enough, less refined than Company of Heroes 2 was, and much more importantly, it feels a lot more sterile than both of the previous games. Company of Heroes 1 and 2 both had a sense of grit about them. They had a specific feel, for lack of a better way of describing it, that resulted in the games having a really strong sense of atmosphere with very visceral combat, and Company of Heroes 3 just doesn't have that. It feels like a pretty generic World War II strategy game, but with the Company of Heroes veneer just occasionally peeking through. And it's all just utterly bewildering, because you take a look at it, and you take a look at how long it took them between Company of Heroes 2 and now, and you just wonder what happened during all of that time. It was a decade between Company of Heroes 2 and the release of Company of Heroes 3. There should have been refinement and actual development and better understanding of the mechanics and expansion of the mechanics, and instead, they basically pulled a Dawn of War 3 again, only not quite as awful as Dawn of War 3 could be. And the most annoying part about the whole mess is that it's impossible not to compare Company of Heroes 3 with both of its predecessors, because it's still a World War II real-time strategy game, and not only are those basically a dime a dozen, but in the case of Company of Heroes, the previous two games were simply far better World War II strategy games than Company of Heroes 3 is. They might have had a bit of a leg to stand on here if it took place in some other conflict. I mean, if they had done, say, the Vietnam War, or the Korean War, or even going back even further than World War II, go back to World War I, then at least you could say the flavor is different, and maybe they could introduce some additional mechanics for these different settings, but no, they just stuck with World War II again, and released a game that feels like they just put in the bare minimum effort needed to produce a somewhat functional video game, and that's it. Out of the many video games that exist, Company of Heroes 3 is certainly one of them, and it's just not worth your money. It's definitely not worth the $60 asking price for the base game, or really $77-ish price if you want the actual full breadth of content that is currently available. Especially when, even if you buy every single bit of the standalone components of Company of Heroes 2, in order to get the full breadth of content for it, you're going to end up at $73 total, so you're still paying less and getting far more content and a much better game out of that. Not to mention the roughly $37 that you can pay for the original Company of Heroes with all of its expansions, and have a much better time with that too. And that's when they're not on sale, by the way. Company Heroes 1 and 2 go on sale quite often and for pretty deep discounts, so you can get them pretty cheap. And so there's definitely value there if you like World War II strategy games or you're looking to get into them, but when you look at Company Heroes 3, there's just no value proposition there. You're paying more for an ultimately much lesser product, and it just leaves you wondering why they even bothered making the game in the first place if they were just going to half-ass it to such a degree. I mean, I guess they were trying to bank on the microtransaction aspect, but the game didn't really sell as well as they were hoping, and Relic ended up having pretty significant layoffs as a result of this game. Not to mention, they were sold by Sega to an independent investor and are technically independent again, although they had even further layoffs after that, so clearly that didn't save them either. I have no idea what is going on with Relic at this point. Obviously, the old guard have basically all left at this point. I don't know where they are anymore. They've scattered to the winds as far as I can tell, but it's abundantly clear at this point that all of the talent and creativity that characterized Relic's output throughout the early to mid-2000s, with games like, of course, the original Homeworld, or Company of Heroes 1, or Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 1, and even to a slightly lesser degree, Dawn of War 2, not to mention Warhammer 40k Space Marine, and the weird and wacky and oft-forgotten, but definitely not by me, impossible creatures. is just not present at the company anymore. At this point, they just seem rooted in the past and not in a good way. I mean, Dawn of War 3 was this really weird hybrid of Dawn of War 1 and 2, and it leaned way too heavily into trying to be a competitive game when it really shouldn't have been. Then Age of Empires 4, again, leaned way too heavily into the competitive side of things at the expense of basically everything else, and it ended up being a mess. If you're interested in that one, I've got a video on that one too. And now, Company of Heroes 3, a game that they basically abandoned Age of Empires 4 to make, I might add, turned out to be so mediocre it's downright bewildering. And while I really didn't have any confidence in Relic's ability to pull off another real-time strategy game after not only Dawn of War 3, but also Age of Empires 4, Company Heroes 3 is basically the final nail in the coffin for the company as far as I'm concerned. I have no confidence that they will ever be able to produce anything other than abject mediocrity at absolute best from here on out. And frankly, that is downright depressing. Relic used to be one of the shining examples of real-time strategy game development. In the early to mid-2000s, they were very much on the cutting edge, experimenting with things, trying new gameplay styles that turned out to work really well in some cases, like of course Company Heroes and Dawn of War, and not quite as well in cases like Impossible Creatures. But no matter what they were doing, you could still tell that there was passion, there was drive, there was creativity and talent, and that's just all gone now. It's just a sad, pathetic husk of what it used to be, and that's really the worst part about this whole thing. Relic Entertainment was one of the last of the old guard of real-time strategy game development studios out there that were still producing real-time strategy games. And to see them just floundering in this level of mediocrity is just depressing. And while it would certainly be nice if they could somehow recover from this and actually produce a truly great real-time strategy game again, I really don't see it happening. I don't really see this studio surviving much longer, honestly. Well, with all the mass layoffs and studio closures going on right now, I would imagine that Relic is probably pretty high on the chopping block in that regard, so who knows how it's gonna go. Obviously, it'd be nice if I were proven wrong on that, if they actually were able to recover and produce good games again, but I'm certainly not going to hold my breath on that, let's put it that way. And as for Company Heroes 3, that free weekend made me want nothing more to do with Company Heroes 3. I will certainly go back and do a redux of the original Company Heroes, and I will of course review Company Heroes 2 whenever I get around to that as well. But the simple fact of the matter is that Company Heroes 3 is just those games, but worse, and it just ends up being really boring, so I have no interest in playing it any further than I already have, and thus, I'm not going to do a full review on it. There's just no point in it. You'd just be far better off spending your time and money on Company Heroes 1 and 2 instead. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.